The background of the story was in a place called Toba, North Sumatra, Indonesia. There lived a man who regularly visited a coffee stall named Mr. Domu. One time, when he was enjoying his time watching TV with his friends in the coffee stall, he accidentally saw his son named Gabe as a comedian on TV. Gabe is his third son. Mr. Domu felt ashamed of him because when Gabe was just a teenager, Mr. Domu always wanted him to be a famous lawyer. Gabe didn't seem very fond of it and decided to do what he wanted. The next scene showed Mrs. Domu, a very obedient wife of Mr. Domu. She was always asked by her husband to convey to her son what her husband wanted him to be. Domu, Mr. and Mrs. Domu's first son, was never of the same opinion as his parents. He worked as an employee for a government company. He intended to marry a Sundanese girl. Mr. Domu, his father, said that he would never give his blessing to them since they were from a different ethnic group, Bataknese, and by marrying another woman from another ethnic group, Domu wouldn't be able to continue the family name to his descendants. Mr. and Mrs. Domu's last son was Saat. He left his parents to live in Jogja with his new foster parents as a farmer. His parents asked him to come back home, since, in Batak tradition, the last son would inherit the house, and so they had to stay there and take care of their parents. When all their sons had left them in the village, their only daughter, who was also their second child named Sarma, remained in the village and took care of them. She worked as a civil servant in the local sub-district office. She stayed there helping her mother with house chores and on the farm taking care of the livestock. One day, Mrs. Doma came to the coffee stall to pick up her husband. The other visitor who saw her scolding her husband laughed at them. She picked up her husband to come with her to her mother's house. In Bataknese, they usually called the mother Opang. When they got there, Mr. Domu told Opang that he would cover all the expenses for the upcoming traditional ceremony called Sulan Sulan Bahopu, a tradition whose purpose was to commemorate the birth of a couple's first child. But since the Domu family was not in a very good financial situation, they could hold the ceremony when they had 4 children already. Opang asked Mr. Domu to persuade his 3 sons to come back to the village for the ceremony since it was important for them to attend it. Opang said that everything would end in vain if her grandsons didn't attend the ceremony. Mr. Domu didn't know how he would do that since he only had a week before the ceremonial day. His wife, who found out that he was the one who would cover the expenses of the ceremony, was mad at him. She then told him that if they still quarreled with each other like that, there was no way their sons would come back home. Hearing that made Mr. Domu realize a brilliant idea. He thought that if they both pretended to divorce, their sons would come back home. Mrs. Domu was shocked to hear the idea and immediately disagreed, but since she missed her sons, she had no other choice but to agree with that. In the morning, during breakfast, Mr. and Mrs. Domu began their acting in front of Sarma. But since they often quarreled, Sarma didn't mind it and suddenly left to work. Looking at that, they wondered what would make Sarma think that they were really on the brink of divorcing. They took the initiative to make it more intense. That night, Mr. Domu deliberately came home late and triggered Mrs. Domu to scream for a divorce.
Ngapain kau pulang?
Nggak pulang kayak mana? Ini rumahku.
Nggak cuma kau yang tinggal di sini. Kau mau pisah.
Kalau iya kenapa?
Bilang abang dan adik-adikmu.
Sarma was afraid that her parents would really be divorced and immediately video called her brothers. She was seen crying during the call and shocked her brothers. Sadly, they said that they wouldn't come home until the problem got worse. They thought that it was just the way their parents are. It was just a regular husband and wife argument. Finding out that their sons weren't convinced enough, Mr. Domu told his wife to go all out. He told her wife to pack her things tomorrow and threatened to go back to her parents' house. Mrs. Domu agreed with the idea. When Sarma saw her mother pack her things, she was worried and rushed to contact her brothers. Mrs. Domu acted like a child and said that she would go back to her parents' house if her sons refused to come back and fix the problem. The sons then decided to come back home to keep her mother from going to her parents' house. Gabe asked her manager for permission to come back to his village for 2 days. Domu asked his soon-to-be father-in-law for permission to go home because of his family issue. He was then threatened that if he didn't come back to Bandung, Domu had to pay for his own wedding ceremony. The last, Saad, asked his family in Jogja for permission to return to his hometown to resolve his family problem. His foster parents turned out to be very kind. Her foster father, Mr. Bromo, gave his permission to Saad to go. He also advised Saad, saying that wherever he is, always be a reliable person to others. When Domu and Gabe arrived at the airport, they were seen not very close to each other. Looking at how his brother didn't get along with each other made Saad irritated. Not long after, Sarma came and hugged her brothers. They had mixed feelings of happiness and sadness. They finally were able to see their sister, but on the other hand, their parents were in a serious problem. On their way home, Gabe said that he had to return since he had a very busy schedule. He said that they had to fix the problem by night so he could leave by the next day. In the house, Mrs. Domu couldn't contain herself when she found out that her children were on their way home. Mr. Domu said that no matter how she had to look cold in front of their children to convince them. Mr. Domu also explained some signals to her, like arguing with him if he pointed his lips or crying when he pointed his eyes. When her children arrived at the house, Mrs. Domu couldn't hold her tears and suddenly hugged her children. On the other hand, Mr. Domu acted sarcastic when he saw Domu, Gabe, and Sahat. He said that they had forgotten the person who always supported them until they became successful like they are now. That night, during dinner time, Mr. and Mrs. Domu did their role. Mrs. Domu successfully convinced their children that she and her husband were having a serious quarrel. Domu, Gabe, Sahat, and Sarma were worried about them. Mr. Domu even suspected the food to be poisoned. Gabe then prayed that nobody would be poisoned after dinner.
Semoga yang memakannya dan gak ada yang meninggal. Amin.
He also irritated Domu by saying that even his delicious mother's cook couldn't bring him back home. After dinner, the children asked their mother about the problem, and with the signal from Mr. Domu, they succeeded to convince their children that she wanted a divorce. After the father went outside to meet his friends, Domu and the others had an idea to separately discuss the problem between their parents. They decided to take their parents for a vacation tomorrow to ease things between them. Gabe hoped that they would be able to solve the problem tomorrow so that he could go back because he had promised his manager that he would be away for 2 days only. Unexpectedly, Mrs. Domu overheard their discussion. At midnight, when the children were asleep, Mrs. Domu approached them and stroked their heads. He remembered the past when they were just kids. She couldn't contain her longing for her children. Not long after, Mr. Domu came and dragged his wife to their room. There, Mrs. Domu told him that the children intended to take them on vacation. Mr. Domu told her to pretend that she didn't enjoy it to convince them that they had a very serious problem. The next day, Sahat woke up his mother and asked her to come with him on vacation to a place called Holbon Hill. At first, Mrs. Domu refused it, but because he kept asking her to come, she finally agreed. On their way to the destination, Mr. and Mrs. Domu once again pretended to argue. Sahat took an initiative to move his seat between the parents so that they would stop arguing with each other. Mr. and Mrs. Domu secretly smiled. They were happy to see how their children cared about them. When they arrived at Holbon Hill, they saw the beauty of Toba Lake. They had a picnic there. The sons then discussed it with Mr. Domu, but instead of getting any solutions for the problem, Mr. Domu blamed them for not following their tradition. Domu, who wanted to marry another woman from another tribe, Gabe, who became a comedian instead of a lawyer, and Saad, who lived in Jogja, were against their father's decision. On the other hand, Mrs. Domu said that she was against them too. She then blamed her husband for his decision that made their sons away from them. The sons decided to eat lunch together and take a picture together to calm the situation. After returning home, they were surprised to see Opang there waiting for them, especially Mr. Domu. He was afraid that his and his wife's plan would be exposed. Luckily, Opang didn't know about their plan. What Opang knew was that Mr. Domus was having a problem with their sons. Later, Opang told the boys that they had to respect their father. He had worked very hard to pay for their school and needs. He also managed to cover the expenses for the Sulan Pahopa ceremony. She then added that for the Batak people, prosperity was not always about money and wealth, but also about descendants. She told them to respect their father because he had worked his days off for their success. Hearing the advice from Opang, they decided to stay there until the end of the Sulan Pahopa ceremony finished. Even Gabe ignored his producer's call until he finished his problem there. Domu said that they need someone older to guide them through the problem, otherwise, they would never be able to solve it. They then called the local pastor to find the solution to their problem. The pastor said that he wouldn't tell anyone about this problem as long as their parents agreed to discuss this. Mr. and Mrs. Domu then left them for a discussion in their room. They both then arranged a new plan because their last plan was falling apart. Not running out of ideas, Mr. Domu told her wife to yell for a divorce so that the pastor and their children would think that they really wanted a divorce. They then said to their children that they would talk about this later after the ceremony finished. To ease the atmosphere, the boys took their mother shopping. They didn't seem to enjoy their time since what they had in their mind was nothing but their job in the city. There, Mrs. Domu decided to take them for lunch to reminisce about their past when the boys were kids. She then ordered a single portion of soyo madan for all of them. The seller said that they ordered a single portion because they didn't have money to pay for it. Gabe gave the seller some money to show him that they were actually rich. One night, Domu saw his sister, Sarma, sitting alone outside of the house. He approached her and asked about her relationship with her boyfriend. Sarma said that she had a breakup with her boyfriend and diverted the topic. She asked why Domu never get along with Gabe and Saad. Domu then explained that Mr. Domu, their father, never showed affection between men, while he was always affectionate with Sarma. This explained how hard Mr. Domus educated and trained his sons. But because of that, even though they finally became a successful person, they never know how to show affection to another man. The ceremonial day finally arrived. On that day, Domu made a mistake when he picked the wrong Yulos cloth. In the Batak tribe, there is a traditional cloth known as Yulos cloth. The Yulos had several patterns for different occasions. Domu, instead of taking the Yulos for Sulan Pahopu, picked the one for the death ceremony. This irritated his father. His father said that if only he married a Bataknese woman, he would know everything about the tradition. Hearing this made Domu irritated. Lucky for them, Sarma was there to stop them from arguing with each other. They then went to Opang's house for the ceremony. After the ceremony was finished, Mr. Domu was seen talking with his friends. His friends told him that he was funny and he derived his funniness to Gabe, and that's why he became a famous comedian like he is now. Mr. Domu instead said that Gabe's job as a comedian was temporary. He said that he would become a very famous lawyer like Hot Man Paris. Gabe was annoyed to hear that to the point he became emotional. Luckily, someone asked for a photo and diverted his anger from his father. Something funny happened when Saad saw a woman who put some food in her handbag. He had left his hometown so long that he forgot how to greet others there. Instead of using the usual way to refer to someone, he used another tribal way to call someone.
Untuk anakku di rumah.
Iya, Namboru.
Kok manggil Namboru? Semarga dengan mamamu.
Aduh maaf, permisi Bude.
Amang jutahe ngirine.
Before they said their goodbyes to Opang, Opang expressed her thanks to Mr. Domu. The Sulon Pahopu could be held because of his big contribution to the expenses. Opang also showed her happiness to see her grandchildren attending the ceremony after a very long time since they left the village. She said that there was nothing more valuable than their presence in the ceremony, especially when she saw how harmonious their family was. At home, when everyone was already in their sleep, Mrs. Domu woke her husband to discuss their next plan to keep their child from returning to their places. She said that she still missed them and wanted to spend more time with them. Mr. Domu said that they had to delay that discussion for tomorrow since he was tired and wanted to sleep. Mrs. Domu kept thinking about it, which kept her awake all night. This led to her fever. Since she had a fever, she couldn't discuss her next plan with her husband about her divorce. They instead talked about Domu's plan to marry a Sundanese woman. His father told him that he strongly disagreed with his plan to marry a woman from another tribe. Domu opposed his father and said that he had the right to choose anything he wanted for the sake of his life. He said that he was mature enough to have his own decision. Gabe then added that he was also against his father's decision. He was happy with his life now and refused to be a lawyer as his father hoped for. Even Saad firmly disagreed with his father. Even though in the Tak tradition, the youngest son would inherit the house and have the responsibility to take care of their parents, Saad said that he still opposed it. That day, when the children were discussing their parents, Gabe informed them that this will be his last day. No matter what happened, even though they couldn't finish the problem, he would still return. He said that if he didn't return, his boss would terminate his contract and he would be charged with the termination penalty. The next day, when Mrs. Domu finally recovered from her fever, they once again discussed the problem in the dining room. At first, Mr. and Mrs. Domu thought that they would be able to keep their children from leaving them, but unexpectedly, Domu and Gabe agreed on the divorce plan and decided to return home at night. Witnessing his children packing their stuff annoyed Mr. Domu. He told them that they were rebellious. He argued with his 3 sons.
Kalian semua sekarang melawan.
Biarkan aku milih apa yang bikin aku bahagia.
Kalian yang bikin bapak bahagia.
Maunya bapak itu nggak bikin kami bahagia, Pak.
Dulu bukan nurut, Pak. Tapi nggak berani ngelawan. Tapi kami belum cukup dewasa untuk ngelawan. Sekarang beda, Pak. Kami udah besar.
Selalu merasa benar sendiri sekarang.
Even Mrs. Domu told him that she was fed up with his selfishness and revealed their lies about the divorce. She said that the plan was just a pretend, but her feeling was not. Her husband's selfishness was the reason why she was far away from her children. The boys then asked Sarma if she knew about their parents' lies. Sarma couldn't contain her tears. She confessed that she knew about it all along. She was forced by her father to keep the secret from anyone. She was always under her father's control. The reason why she broke up with her boyfriend was that her father knew that her boyfriend was Javanese. Sarma even confessed that her dream was to become a chef, not a civil servant like what her father wanted her to be. Hearing that, the boys felt miserable for their sister. They left their sister behind to take care of their parents when they fulfilled their ambition. Looking at all this mess, Mrs. Domu decided to return to her parents' house. She decided to do the divorce, but that time was for real. After returning from the coffee stall, Mr. Domu saw nobody in his house. Mrs. Domu and Sarma decided to stay at Mrs. Domu's parents' house. He also told him that Domu and Gabe had returned to their place, leaving him behind. He then revealed why he loved Mr. Bromo, his foster father. He said Mr. Bromo always listened to him and supported whatever he wanted to be. Mr. Bromo was the one who persuaded Saad to return to Toba and met his parents. After telling all those things, Saad expressed his goodbye and went back to Jakarta. Days passed and Mr. Domu was all alone in his house. He rarely ate anything and felt lonely all the time. He then visited Opang, his mother. He said that he missed his mother's cooking. Opang then explained why she didn't come to visit him because Sarma told her to do so. Sarma had explained everything to her and told her not to visit him to teach him a lesson. Sarma wanted to teach her father that he actually needed his children and wife. Opang then told Mr. Domu to appreciate his children's decision. He then went to Mrs. Domu's parents' house to meet her. According to the Tak tradition, Mr. Domu and his parents came to apologize to Mrs. Domu's family. There, Mr. Domo asked his wife to return with him to their house, but she refused. She said that if he wanted her to return to their house, he had to come back there with their sons to pick her up. In a live broadcast on a TV program, Gabe was seen doing his job as a comedian. Unexpectedly, Gabe was surprised to see his father there as a surprise for him. Mr. Domo then apologized to Gabe for what he had done to him all this time. He said that no matter his job now, he would be proud and pray for his success. After meeting Gabe, Mr. Domo then went to Sandy's house. Sandy was Domo's soon-to-be wife. There, Mr. Domo wasn't expected that after living for so long in Bandung, his son, Domo, was never actually forgetting his tradition. He even taught Sandy a little bit about the Batak tradition. Even more, Sandy said that she was willing to do a Bataknese wedding ceremony at her wedding with Domo later. Finally, Mr. Domo went to see Saad at Mr. Bromo's house in Yogyakarta. There, Mr. Bromo told him how the villagers there really loved Saad for his work and dedication. Saad had been teaching the villagers how to grow crops in the Batak tradition. Hearing that made Mr. Domo proud of his son. He could be useful to people around him. Mr. Domo finally had gathered his 3 sons. He then went to meet his wife and Sarma to pick them up and return home. Mrs. Domo said that she would accept Mr. Domo's apology and return home with them, but before that, she invited them to eat her cooking called migoma. After all the problems they experienced, they finally solved them and lived their harmonious life again.